Picture two couples who live on the same street. Both are 68 years old. Both spent 4 decades working. Both walked into retirement last spring with nearly identical savings. If you drove past their houses right now, you genuinely could not tell them apart. But 20 years from now, one of these couples will have run out of money somewhere in their early 80s. The other will leave their grandchildren a meaningful inheritance. The difference between those two outcomes isn't luck, and it isn't income. It's a set of spending decisions that started looking very different somewhere around their mid-40s. And those decisions compounded quietly for 20 years while nobody was watching. The first and most expensive habit hiding in plain sight is the new car every 3 years. A new $50,000 vehicle loses roughly 20% of its value in the first year alone, and about 60% by year 5. That's $30,000 in depreciation that disappears whether you drive the car constantly or barely touch it. The research Thomas Stanley did for the Millionaire Next Door showed that more American millionaires drive Toyotas than BMWs, that about 37% of the millionaires he surveyed bought their cars used, and that only 23% were driving a current model year. His most striking finding was that the typical American spends roughly 30% of their net worth on a vehicle. Millionaires spend about 1%. Compare that to someone who's been rolling one car loan into the next since 2019, keeping a monthly payment around $850 permanently in place and calling it a reasonable deal. It is not a reasonable deal. If you hold a car for 10 years instead of trading every 3 and invest what you would have spent on that cycle of depreciation and payments, the difference by the time you hit 80 is somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000. That's not transportation savings. That's a second retirement sitting untouched because someone refused to care what their neighbors thought about their driveway. Boats and RVs follow exactly the same logic and usually hit harder. New recreational vehicles lose 20 to 30% of their value in the first year. Class A motorhomes lose more than half by year 10. Then add storage fees, insurance, fuel, and slip fees for a boat, which run anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000 annually on a modest setup, and you've built something that costs you continuously while sitting largely unused. The famous line about the 2 best days of owning a boat being the day you buy it and the day you sell it has become a cliche, specifically because it describes the experience of nearly every retiree who has ever owned one. So Stanley's data showed there were nearly 5 times as many boat owners in America as there were people who left an estate of any meaningful size. Most boats in this country are owned by people who cannot genuinely afford them. The real millionaires are watching from the shore. Run the specific numbers on a motorhome purchase, and it gets difficult to look at. A retired couple buys a $150,000 Class A at 65. Over 10 years, they spend $25,000 in fuel, $10,000 in maintenance, and $12,000 in storage, and absorb $60,000 in depreciation. They use it 11 weeks total. The all-in cost per week of actual vacation is close to $10,000. For $10,000 a week, you could stay somewhere remarkable with someone bringing you breakfast. Instead, you are emptying a holding tank in a campground parking lot in the rain. The wealthy retiree rented an RVs for the one trip they actually wanted to take. That is the entire difference between those two outcomes. Timeshares are another category that looks like an investment and functions like a trap. Open any resale platform and search for timeshares, and you will find listings priced at $1, not as a starting bid, but as the actual asking price because the current owner wants to stop paying annual maintenance fees badly enough to hand over a piece of real estate for less than a vending machine snack. Some sellers will pay you to take the unit because even giving it away is cheaper than continuing to hold it. Timeshares purchased from developers for $20,000 to $40,000 routinely resell for under $100. Even the best performing resale category in the entire industry tops out at about 15% of the original developer price. And the maintenance fees keep arriving every year, typically $900 to $3,000, rising over time and in many cases, passing to your heirs when you die. A straightforward calculation shows that a $15,000 purchase plus $900 a year in fees over 15 years works out to roughly $270 per night for a hotel room you can only use at a single location. A comparable hotel down the street charges less and includes breakfast. No sales seminar, no countdown clock, no complimentary drinks designed to soften your resistance to signing something. Whole life insurance and variable annuities represent a category where the financial damage is less visible, but often more severe. A healthy 30-year-old can buy $500,000 of term life coverage for around $20 a month. The whole life version of that exact policy from the same insurer runs $400 to $500 a month. The difference goes primarily to the agent's commission, which on a whole life policy can equal an entire year of premiums. If you took that monthly difference and invested it in a broad market index fund instead, the compounded result over 30 years falls somewhere between $560,000 and $700,000. The whole life policy in the same window builds maybe $50,000 to $80,000 in cash value, which you then have to borrow against and pay interest on to access. It is your own money and they charge you to use it. Variable annuities, which are the products sold most aggressively to retirees, carry total annual fees that commonly run between 2 and 4%. A documented case study showed one retiree holding a $1.7 million variable annuity paying close to 4% in fees annually, generating $88,000 per year in income. A comparable product with a 1% fee structure would have generated $177,000. That client was losing nearly $90,000 a year in retirement income to fees, which over 20 years represents a staggering transfer of wealth from her retirement to the people who sold her the product. The rule wealthy retirees apply to this category is simple. If the person selling it earns a commission on the sale, the product was designed around their interest, not yours. The vacation home is the fantasy purchase that ends more retirements than almost anything else on this list. The pitch is always the same. We will use it 10 weekends a year, the grandkids will love it, and we can rent it out when we are not there. What actually happens is that property taxes, insurance, homeowners association fees, and basic maintenance on a $400,000 lake house runs $16,000 a year before you spend a single night there. Furnishing it on day one costs $25,000. A new roof arrives in year 7 for $18,000. The HVAC goes in year 9 for $9,000. By year 5, the kids are busy. The drive feels longer than it used to, and the place sits empty most of the year. Stanley's research on this was clear. Income affluent people buy second homes. People with real wealth rent for the 1 month a year they want to be somewhere specific. Same view, same lake, none of the carrying costs, none of the capital locked away and not compounding. A $400,000 property held for 20 years instead of invested at a reasonable return represents somewhere around $1.5 million that will not be passed on to anyone. Country club membership is another recurring expense that looks different when you actually run the math on it. Initiation fees at mid-tier clubs have risen dramatically in recent years, now routinely running between $30,000 and $50,000, with annual dues adding another $1,500 to $10,000 on top. Add cart fees, guest fees, locker fees, and the quarterly food minimum, which is a fee structure that requires you to spend a set amount on dining each quarter simply to maintain your membership, and the realistic all-in annual cost for an active member sits somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. If you play 30 rounds a year against $20,000 in annual costs, that is $667 per round at a course that charges $50 to guest players. You're paying 13 times the per round cost for slightly better tee times and the ability to mention the club in conversation. That is a subscription to a feeling, not to a service. Regular financial support to adult children is the trap that almost nobody talks about openly, which is part of why it does so much damage. Research shows that roughly half of American parents with adult children are providing regular financial support. averaging close to $1,500 a month. That is nearly $18,000 a year, flowing from the retirement savings of someone who spent decades building it toward a lifestyle that the recipient would otherwise need to fund themselves. The compounding math on that transfer is brutal. Sustaining $1,500 a month indefinitely at a 4% withdrawal rate requires an additional $4.5 million in savings as a cushion. Almost nobody has that, which means every month that transfer continues, retirement security is being quietly dismantled. The distinction wealthy retirees make on this is between episodic help, a wedding contribution, a down payment, a genuine medical emergency, and routine transfer. One is an expression of generational wealth. The other is a standing arrangement that gradually converts retirement security into someone else's spending money. Status spending on clothing and accessories follows a pattern Stanley documented thoroughly. Half of American millionaires had never paid more than $235 for their most expensive watch. The most common watch brand among millionaires in his follow-up research was Seiko, not Rolex. He noted that millionaires who did wear Rolexes had typically received them as gifts and were often embarrassed to wear them. The people spending $20,000 on watches and $4,000 on suits are not the millionaires. They are people trying to appear to be millionaires, a group Stanley called the pseudo-affluent, high income but low assets, confused about which one actually matters. Wealthy retirees have generally figured out that the audience they once dressed for, clients, colleagues, the professional network, has completely dissolved. Nobody in their current life is forming an opinion about their watch. The signal it was supposed to send no longer has a receiver. Premium grocery and dining habits accumulate into something significant over a full retirement. The difference between store brand staples and premium branded versions of the same product might be 20 or 30% per item. Across a full grocery budget over years, that difference is real money. More significantly, eating at restaurants multiple times a week at current prices creates an expense category that compounds over the length of a retirement into something that would genuinely shock most people if they calculated it in advance. The wealthy retirees who stay wealthy are not living on nothing. They eat well and they travel. They have just stopped paying restaurant margins on routine meals and stopped treating convenience as a cost they do not need to track. The pattern that ties everything else together is this. Wealthy retirees who stay wealthy are not uniformly frugal people with no appetite for enjoyment. Most of them have very full lives. What they share is that somewhere in their 40s, they sat down and looked at what each recurring expense in their life was actually costing them. Not just the monthly number, but the compounded opportunity cost over 20 or 30 years. And they were genuinely unsettled by what they found. That calculation changes how you see things. A boat stops looking like a boat and starts looking like the beach house you were going to leave your grandchildren. A car lease stops looking like a reasonable monthly payment and starts looking like $400,000 sitting in someone else's pocket instead of yours. Once you see the math that way, the decisions that follow are not really discipline. They are just the obvious conclusion of understanding what the numbers actually say.